For those of you interested in fast Thunderbolt 4 SSD storage, there are more options emerging and these are really interesting. Thunderbolt 5 options are still more limited, but fast DAS devices are becoming more common. And I'm going to spend some time looking at various options over the coming months and paying particular interest as options become available for Thunderbolt 5. Now in this video, I'm going to take a detailed look at the TerraMaster D4 SSD DAS. Now this unit provides Thunderbolt 4 and USB 4 speed, but also provides capacity for 4 SSDs, which provides really good SSD storage potential. Now when paired with SoftRAID, it opens up even more options for even greater access speeds as well as for data protection. And I'm going to show you how to configure this DAS for various RAID options, and we're going to performance test the SSDs and the RAID configurations to see what you can actually expect. Now when looking at SSD devices, speed is obviously a key consideration because SSDs are very often going to be bottlenecked by I/O if they're not physically installed in a 4-lane slot in your device. And this is especially relevant for Mac users, as Apple has really neutered the ability for users to do this with their hardware design, but it does still also have relevance for Windows and Linux also. And the other consideration, of course, is heat, which needs managing in SSDs to prevent performance impact from things like throttling. And if you're moving to Gen 5 PCIe cards, then this is even more true than ever. And as I have covered, there are also expanding NAS options with SSD and 5 and 10 gigabit Ethernet. But at the end of the day, Thunderbolt offers even more bandwidth than this, so it's of keen interest to those who use I/O intensive workflows. An example would be video editing. So let's get into the F4 SSD and see what it offers and how it could solve problems around your storage needs. So first up, it is a simple device, and what it comes with in the box is also simple as a result. There's the unit itself, it comes with a small power supply and then a Thunderbolt USB 4 cable. Now the cable that's included does seem to be of high quality, and certainly I had no issues with it during testing. If we look inside, it's again a simple device with 4 NVMe slots. But what is interesting here is that unlike many of the devices I've seen that come with a single Gen 3 lane on each slot, this device provides a 1 PCIe Gen 4 lane per slot. And this is really pleasing, and we'll see what it means in terms of testing. Having the bandwidth spread out over 4 slots here means that you can maximize the Thunderbolt 4 bandwidth along with storage capacity, and the ability to do this with RAID. If you're worried about each slot only having 1 lane, we're going to see why this doesn't really matter during the testing, because ultimately we're limited by that 40 gigabits per second bandwidth on that Thunderbolt interface anyway. Now the device appears to be based on the ASMedia 2464PD chipset, which in my opinion at least seems to be the current best option for Thunderbolt 4 throughput. It's actually the same chipset that I saw on the Zyte drive and the Ugreen NVMe enclosures I looked at recently, and it potentially provides around 3200 megabytes per second. Now if you are wondering why the gap between 40 gigabits per second and 3200 megabytes per second, this is really about how the data channel is provided in Thunderbolt 4. So it turns out that 3200 megabytes per second is actually around the theoretical maximum that you can expect, and this is really just due to the design of Thunderbolt 4 and the protocol overhead. Now installing the NVMe drives is easy, as you can see here. I would recommend 2 things here: knowing which drives are in which slot, and I would also recommend using heat sinks. Now temperature tests are coming up, but the spoiler is that the cooling system actually seems really solid, but running NVMe's cooler is never a bad thing, and we will get to see what difference it makes on the SSDs during the testing. The unit is only set up for the 2280 form factor of NVMe's, but these are the ones you're likely to get anyway, but you should bear that in mind. As for the slot locations, Linux and macOS will map drives to kind of non-deterministic device IDs, and if you're using RAID and you have a drive failure, do not want to be replacing the incorrect drive. If you're putting heat sinks on, it can be even harder to identify which SSD is which, so I would at this moment note down the serial numbers and which slots they're in, so we can label them once we're into the OS. You can see here that slot 1 is the furthest away from the fans, with slot 4 being the closest. Now opening and closing the unit is super easy with just a single thumb screw and then sliding the case on and off, and it's nicely designed and it does work really well. So I like the hardware, I like the design and the cooling, and which is also very quiet by the way. As we'll see, the DAS provides also really good solid performance. I'll be testing individual SSD speeds, but also I'll be doing some testing of RAID0, RAID5 and RAID0+1 also. Plugging it in is also pretty foolproof. It's just the power cord and the USB-C. Now to get full speed, it does need connecting to a USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 port. For example, on the base Mac Mini M4 here, there are 3 ports on the back that provide that 40 gigabits per second connectivity. The front ones are USB 3.2 only, and they only provide 10 gigabits. Once in macOS, the cards will show up in the disk utility as separate drives. Now if they're new, you should probably start by erasing the disk and giving it a name. And it's a great place to include the slot number also that we noted down when installing the drives. macOS doesn't make it simple to match a serial number to the device in the disk utility, but it is easy with the SmartCTL tool. You can get this from smartmontools.org, but if you don't want to use this, you can join the dots with System Profiler, but it's not very simple. Now if we run the smartctl-x command with the ID of the disk from the disk utility, and then we grep for the serial number, this will give us the number to identify which slot we have, and then we can compare our notes and we can add the slot number into the name. Now as a side note, System Profiler can also be used to go find the device and vendor ID for the enclosure, and this is what allows me to check which chipset is actually in use on the unit. And you can see here that the vendor ID is 174C, which is AS Media, and the device ID is 2463, which is their 2464 PD Thunderbolt controller. So first of all, we're going to performance test all these drives individually. This will show performance to each slot, but it also allows you to make some educated decisions about which drives you should populate the DAS with. We will then get RAID configured and we'll test performance for some RAID options. The device and all the tested disks will be linked below with Amazon affiliate links to go check on prices, because these can vary and also deals can be had from time to time. Okay, so let's get to the performance testing, and for this I use a selection of 2TB cards that I like to use for different things. And this includes the Lexar NM790, the Samsung 990 Pro and the WD SN850X. Now I also threw in a lower cost card here in the WD SN770, and we're going to see why this is useful to look at, but all of these cards are Gen 4 TLC NAND cards. Okay, first of all, a full drive write, and the 850X here from Western Digital performed best overall, hitting a consistent 1638 megabytes per second for the first 600 gigabytes of data, and then falling back to about 1360 megabytes per second for the rest of the drive. The Samsung 990 Pro, which is also a card I really like, delivered the same 1638 for the first 250 gigabytes, and then it dropped back to about 1200 megabytes per second, before slowly recovering back to 1520 megabytes per second. Both the SN850X and the 990 Pro show almost identical performance with and without heatsinks. Next, the Lexar NM790, which is typically a little cheaper than the previous two, primarily as it utilises system RAM for cache and it doesn't come with its own DRAM. Now, the 850X and the 990 Pro, they come with 2 gigabytes on board. Now this card still kept up a really solid performance of around 1620 megabytes per second, all the way to 50% of the capacity, and then it dropped back to around 800 for 25%, and then it recovered. Two things to note on this card. Firstly, this performance profile seems to be driven by the fact that the TLC NAND can still be written to faster than the single Gen 4 lane speed of the DAS of around 1600 megabytes per second. But when the SoC cache starts folding, which is where it starts to convert the SoC cache to TLC NAND, this seems to occur at a maximum of about 800 megabytes per second, and this seems to explain what is happening in this chart. Now the other thing to note is that the Tech PowerUp SSD database does indicate that there is a new 2025 version of this card that uses QLC configured NAND. Now this is something for another video, but if this is true, it looks bad. Primarily as significant changes to a drive with the same model number isn't a good thing in my opinion. Though we'll have to try and get hold of one of these to actually test this to see if it's true and what it really means for performance. Now lastly, I use the WD SN770, which is still a TLC Gen 4 card, but it's a more budget option and it performs worse than its SN850X sibling. And we can see here, it also performs just as well as the others all the way to around 720 gigabytes, but then the performance tanks hard. And this is because although this card has a relatively large SLC cache, the folding speed on the controller is low and the TLC NAND speed likewise. Now these drop-offs only matter if you're making very large writes, and in this case we're talking over 700 gigabytes in one go. So for most users it simply won't matter, but I included this so we can see what impact this can have when used in a RAID array and see if it matters to you, and this way you can decide which drives to buy. Looking at the read performance, we see that all the drives here performed almost identically with around 1680 megabytes per second consistently for the full test. So your drive selection is going to impact write performance way more than it's going to impact read performance. And if you're more worried about read performance than write, then you can really economize significantly on your SSD choice. And this is especially true when you're looking at an SSD NAS, or for that matter, even an SSD NAS. Nearly all SSD max throughput is going to exceed the available I/O on an external device, and you're only really going to get the maximum from an SSD when it's a local Gen 4 or Gen 5 X4 slot directly on the PCIe bus. Now note that all these drop-offs in performance are attributed to the SSDs and not the DAS, which appears to deliver a consistent 1640 megabytes per second to each slot for write and 1680 megabytes for reads. Now, if we look at the times to fully read and write 2 terabytes to and from each drive with the average bandwidth, we can see this here. For writes, the SN850X comes in fastest at 22 minutes and 44 seconds for the heat-sinked unit and 22 minutes and 43 seconds without the cooler, for an average 1438 megabytes per second in both cases. So this drive often runs as one of the hottest, so the fact that it can do this without any throttling or performance impact is really a testament to the cooling inside this device. The 990 Pro is the next fastest at 24 minutes and 56 seconds with the heatsink and 24 minutes and 49 without. So again, the heatsink seems to make no difference and the variance is really within the margin of error. So this is an average of 1634 and 1633 megabytes respectively. The NM790 came in next with good overall performance, but it was dragged down by a period here where it only ran at 800 megabytes per second, and it completed with times of 28 minutes and 37 seconds with the heatsink and a slightly slower 29 minutes and 8 seconds without it installed. So this is an average of 1141 megabytes per second and 1122 megabytes for the other test. Now the SN770, though fine for writes up to around 720 gigabytes, if pushed beyond its SLC cache, it became far slower, and with a total write time of 1 hour 9 minutes and 47 seconds with the heatsink and 1 hour and 13 minutes and 2 seconds without, this only produced an average of 470 megabytes per second with and 448 without the cooler. And this is less than half the speed of all the others, and it's actually closer to a third the speed of the SN850X sibling. Now we can look at the heat graphs, and this tells us kind of what's going on with the cooling, right? And it seems that the Lexar runs the coolest of all of them, barely affected by the heatsink. The SN770 is next, with the 990 Pro also not far behind. Now the WD SN850 runs by far the hottest, and the heatsink on this SSD reduces its temperatures by a solid 10 degrees Celsius. Even with the heatsink, the SN850 runs a lot hotter than the other cards without a cooler. But again, this doesn't seem to come at the detriment of performance, and even with full drive writes, the 850X without a heatsink copes just fine in this DAS. So this device is doing a really solid job on the cooling, and it shows that TerraMaster have done well with implementing the cooling solution that they've used. Now, having tested the drives individually, we can now get RAID configured, and for this we're going to use SoftRAID from OWC. Now this software has a good reputation, it's flexible and it's easy to use, and I'll probably do a different video covering the software more completely, but today we're just going to do the basic steps to get the drives into an array and where we can get performance testing done on the DAS in RAID0, RAID5, RAID0+1 scenarios. And this helps us assess the full performance offering that comes with the DAS. So I'm going to start by initializing these 4 disks in SoftRAID, which only takes a few seconds, and then we can add them to a new volume configured in this case for RAID0. Now you can select the other RAID types here, and I would normally use RAID5 here to get data protection, but we're talking a little bit more about the RAID option shortly as we do that testing. So we can then also label the disks with their slots inside SoftRAID. So if we do run into problems in the future with any disk, like for example SoftRAID is reporting errors or issues with, for example, smart data, we know exactly which one to physically replace. You can also set up RAID, of course, using the Apple Disk utility if you want to, because a full license for SoftRAID isn't cheap, but it is possible to set up a RAID volume using a free trial and then use their free standard tier license to continue to use and maintain the array. You just can't create new RAID volumes or get some advanced functionality without paying for their premium license. So the choice is yours, and I'm just using SoftRAID here to test the performance of the DAS. Let's look at the performance test to see what you can expect from 4 2 terabyte drives, each of the RAID configurations. With RAID 0, first of all, you get no data protection and no redundancy, but you do get maximum space and performance. All data is striped across all 4 of the drives, which means you get the combined write performance and all 8 terabytes of usable space. But it does mean the loss of any one drive would result in the loss of all data. So this is a setup you use for performance where data loss is acceptable. For example, it's good when you're working with data, but not actually using it for reliable, safe storage of that data. So first of all, the array with 2 Lexar NM790s, 1 Samsung 990 Pro, and a WD SN850X. Now we initially get the full expected performance from that Thunderbolt 4 connection at around 3200 megabytes per second. There is then a drop off, and then there's some variability in the performance between 2000 and 3000 megabytes per second for the remainder of the 8 terabytes array. Now if we do the same test, but we insert one of those WD SN770 drives into the array in place of one of the Lexar NM790s, now the profile has some similarities up to about 37%, but then you do get a really significant drop off, after which the max write speed is pegged at 1250 megabytes per second. Now this is around 4 times the speed of the SN770 when we test it on its own, and it shows that because the data is equally distributed over the 4 drives, the array performance is constrained by the slowest drive. So this is an important thing to consider when you're making your drive selections. Next, we look at RAID5 performance, and in this configuration, the capacity of one drive is reserved for parity. This provides data protection and it allows the array to be recovered from any single failed drive. And this is why it's important to know which drive is in each slot, as replacing the wrong slot following a failed drive will result in ultimately the loss of 2 drives and the loss of the whole array. So if one of your disks is showing serious issues, you want to make sure you are replacing the failed one and not another drive. Maximum performance here is around 72% that of RAID 0 at about 2140 megabytes per second, which makes sense as the data is split 3 ways instead of 4, with the remaining throughput dedicated to writing parity. However, in many respects, the performance chart follows a similar pattern, showing that the drives are the constraint here, not the enclosure. And by around 1 terabyte into the write, performance is fairly close actually between the RAID 0 and the RAID 5 configuration. And you'll also notice the performance line here for RAID 5 is shorter, and that is because RAID 5 surrenders 25% of its capacity to parity, so the array is now only 6 terabytes and not 8. So lastly, we look at the RAID0+1 array. Now this array is a pair of drives in RAID 0 and then mirrored to 2 other drives for data protection. Now because this solution uses SoftRAID, all data needs copying twice over the Thunderbolt interface. Once to the first 2 drives in the RAID 0 stripe and then to the other 2 drives that are doing the mirror of this. So the maximum performance you could expect is around 50% based on the bandwidth over the Thunderbolt link. But as the SSDs fill, the drives themselves become the bottleneck and the speed is limited to around 1400 megabytes per second, which would be consuming about 2800 megabytes per second in total for the duplicate writes. And this is below the available bandwidth of the DAS of 3200 megabytes per second. So at this point, the drives themselves are the bottleneck, even though they're very capable SSDs. And because you're sacrificing 50% of your capacity for data protection here, you only get half the capacity at 2 terabytes. I also have serious reservations, by the way, about using RAID 0+1, so I'm not suggesting you use it, but I'm just showing you the benchmarks to help highlight how Thunderbolt bandwidth and the SSD bandwidths come into play here. So personally, I would go RAID 5 here, and I would not neglect my backups either. Okay, now looking at read performance, and this is best with the RAID 0 array at about 2850 megabytes per second. With the RAID 0+1, it's coming in at around 2600 megabytes, and then RAID 5 at around 2240 megabytes per second. So all of these are faster than a single drive, but they don't achieve full Thunderbolt 4 throughput. And this is likely just the processing overhead to reassemble the data from the striping for each in the array inside SoftRAID. So depending on your prioritization of performance versus data safety, this is what you can expect from the DAS. And of course, I use 2 terabyte drives in this test, as it's what I had available for testing, but you could spend more if your budget allows and your capacity needs demand it. And you can get 32 terabytes in RAID 0, 24 terabytes in RAID 5 configuration, and 16 in RAID 0+1 if you were to go ahead and use 8 terabyte SSDs. In all these scenarios, performance is solid. And if you're not performing multi-terabyte writes, you can economize some on your SSDs. Just make sure you stick with Gen 4 cards. But before I conclude, please also do support the channel by hitting the thumbs up if this was useful or interesting, and consider a subscribe if storage content is of interest to you. Links to all the hardware tested is below, and all of this helps grow this very small channel, and it is always really appreciated. So let's talk the conclusions. If you're looking for high capacity, high speed, local SSD access, a Thunderbolt DAS like this is a really great option. It's cheaper and it's less complex than running a NAS. It doesn't require that you have 10 gigabits networking, and it provides far better performance for tasks like video editing or other I/O intensive workflows. Downside, of course, is it's not good as a collaboration device. So if you do need to collaborate with data with other people and share the content, then a NAS is going to be a better option. The F4 SSD NAS from TerraMaster is only around $100 more, and it provides a full function NAS. I'm going to link that review below, but that's also something to consider. And because you can get a full featured NAS with an N95 CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, 5 gig Ethernet, USB 3.2 and an HDMI for just $100 more, I do think this device could be a little bit lower than the $300 price point, but there are not actually many choices at this price point, especially with this performance, and it's honestly a really nicely built device that offers superb throughput and excellent cooling. So it's also really physically compact and it's very quiet, and if you do audio work, this is also important. I would personally heatsink the NVMe's just to be kind to them, but it doesn't look like it's required with the cooling in this unit. And even with full drive writes, there's really no sign of throttling, even on the WD SN850X, which is, as I've said before, is one of the hottest NVMe SSDs. Now, if you'd asked a few months ago, I would have probably picked the NM790 from Lexar to put in here, as it runs cool and comes in at a good price. It has a little lower performance, but in a device like this, it's probably going to be marginal. I mentioned my concern earlier in this video about a possible change to the spec on that card, so that needs looking into. The 990 Pro from Samsung is always a solid choice, and I use these in lots of places. And of course the SN850X provides the best performance, but it's more pricey and it runs hotter. So yes, this unit does exactly what it says in the marketing material, and I'm impressed with it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this fits your needs, or maybe even what other options you're considering. And in the meantime, I'll see you in the next video.